It was meant to be a wedding that united two families, but by dawn, it had erased an entire town. What began with a kiss ended with silence so complete it still echoes through the Virginia hills. The day had been warm, touched by the soft bloom of early spring. The Thorne estate, a sprawling manor set among the sloping orchards of Albemarle County, was dressed in ribbons and lanterns. The air smelled of lilac and wine, and laughter carried across the fields like a hymn. It was said to be the finest wedding the county had ever seen. Elias Thorne, heir to the Thorne name, marrying Cora Bell, the quiet schoolteacher from the valley below. The entire town had come to witness it. Farmers, merchants, even the parish choir. But by dawn, there would be no witnesses left to tell what truly transpired. When investigators arrived the following morning, the house was still. The great oak doors hung open, music sheets scattered across the floor, tables laden with untouched food. Candles burned low, wax pooled over silver plates, and glasses of wine remained half-filled as though every guest had risen from their seat mid-toast and simply walked away. Horses were still tethered to posts, their reins tangled and eyes wide. A child's bonnet lay in the grass near the fountain. Inside, the air carried a faint metallic tang, like the aftermath of a storm, though no storm had passed that night. The ballroom was the strangest of all. A place meant for celebration now held only echoes. Dust motes drifted in the light that filtered through lace curtains. The long banquet table stood undisturbed, each chair pushed neatly in place. Yet the room felt inhabited, as if it remembered the weight of those who had been there hours before. On the far wall hung a single photograph, its glass cracked in one corner. It showed Elias and Cora standing before the altar, his hand on hers, her eyes lifted toward his. Behind them stretched the long lawn where guests had gathered, but in the photograph, the crowd was gone. Not blurred, not overexposed, gone. Only the bride and groom stood in a void of grass and fog. Neighbors who arrived soon after spoke of an unnatural silence. Even the birds avoided the orchard. The pond near the rear of the estate, once bright with reflections, now lay dark, its surface unbroken. Sheriff Nathaniel Clay would later write that the air felt too full as though it were holding its breath. The wedding registry listed 118 names. None were ever found again. Only 2 signatures remained visible, the last written by the bride and groom themselves. The ink, they said, was still wet when discovered. And beneath it, pressed faintly into the page, was a mark that no one could read, a curve like a crescent, or perhaps a smile. Thornfield Hall rose from the Virginia hills like something the earth had not built, but rather tolerated. Its stones were older than the county itself, quarried before the Revolution, darkened by lichen and the breath of passing storms. The house was vast, its wings stretching unevenly across the slope, as if it had been added to by hands that could not stop building. Locals said that every generation of Thornes added a room and sealed another, so that over the decades the corridors formed a kind of maze, one that even the servants feared to walk after dusk. Its windows, narrow and tall, reflected little of the outside world. When the sun set, they became black mirrors that returned the face of whoever dared to look too long. The Thorne family were landowners, their wealth drawn from orchards that bore fruit late and sweet, despite soil that others swore was barren. They employed few workers and preferred to tend the property themselves, often at night. Travelers on the road to Charlottesville spoke of seeing lanterns moving in neat lines through the trees at impossible hours, each light pausing and swaying in rhythm, like part of some quiet procession. The air around Thornfield carried a scent of iron and apple blossom, a combination that made visitors dizzy if they lingered too long. Inside, the manor was a museum of its own bloodline. Portraits lined every hall, faces repeating through the centuries. Men with the same high brow and dark eyes, women pale and unsmiling, each painting so similar that it was difficult to tell one generation from the next. In the great hall, a family crest hung carved in oak, a serpent biting its own tail beneath a motto no scholar could fully translate. The servants whispered that the letters changed when no one watched. Though the Thornes were respected for their wealth, their presence unsettled their neighbors. They seldom attended gatherings, and when they did, they stood apart, their courtesy immaculate but cold. Invitations to Thornfield were rare, and those who received them often returned quieter, slower, as if something of the house had followed them home. The family's lineage, recorded meticulously in their own hand, bore no gaps, no missing names, no unmarked graves. Yet the county registrar showed otherwise, entire generations absent from public record, as though the Thornes had edited their own history. At the heart of the estate lay the Mirror Lake, a still pond that never froze in winter and never rippled in wind. Locals said it reflected not the sky, but whatever the viewer most feared. On nights when the moon was high, its surface glowed faintly, and from the upper windows of Thornfield Hall, it was said one could see faces moving across it, hundreds of them, drifting like reflections waiting to be claimed. Elias Thorne had always carried the stillness of his family name, the kind of quiet that drew a room into silence without command. He was tall, angular, his features carved with the same restraint as the portraits that lined Thornfield's halls. His eyes, dark and reflective, seemed never to settle on a person but rather through them, as though he was forever looking at something just behind. Those who knew him, few as they were, spoke of his poise and intellect, of his voice that seldom rose above a murmur. Yet beneath that civility lingered something colder, something watchful. He rarely ventured into town, and when he did, it was said that clocks seemed to slow in the shops he entered, that the air felt heavier until he left again. Cora Bell was his opposite in every outward way, a schoolteacher from a nearby parish, raised without fortune but rich in reputation. She was described as gentle, with a kindness that quieted even the rowdiest children. Her handwriting, preserved in old letters, was graceful and exacting. Those who knew her best could not explain what drew her into the orbit of Elias Thorne. The two met, it was said, when she came to Thornfield to tutor the children of a cousin. Within a month, she had accepted his proposal. To some, it seemed romantic, to others, reckless. The Thornes did not often marry outside their own bloodline, and whispers followed her engagement like smoke. Their wedding was held in the spring of 1871, under a canopy of white blossoms that had appeared weeks too early. The orchards glowed that evening, as if lit from beneath. Guests recalled the air being unusually warm for the season, carrying the scent of apples though none were in bloom. Cora wore a gown of silk that caught the light like water. Elias stood beside her in black, his expression unreadable. When the vows were spoken, the officiant's voice wavered, a tremor not from emotion but from something else, something pressing, unseen, that thickened the air around the congregation. And then came the kiss. Witnesses would later describe it in fragments longer than proper, a moment stretched beyond its natural span. Some said the wind rose though no leaves moved. Others felt the ground shift faintly, as though the earth itself exhaled. A child in the back row began to cry without knowing why. The candles lining the altar flared bright, bending their flames sideways. When the couple parted, the light dimmed again, and everything fell silent, too silent, like the world had missed a breath. The music resumed, laughter soon after, but more than one guest was seen touching their chest, confused, as if something inside them had just been rearranged. Later that night, as the celebration spilled from ballroom to garden, a storm was seen forming far beyond the hills. Yet, not a drop of rain would fall on Thornfield. The air remained still, unnaturally so. Those who looked upon the bride and groom swore their movements had grown slower, synchronized, their eyes reflecting the same glint of candlelight. In that shared gaze, some saw love. Others, something infinite and unearthly, as if their union had stitched together more than hearts, perhaps a doorway. The morning light came slow to Thornfield Hall, filtered through mist that clung low over the valley like breath upon glass. A servant girl named Clara was the first to rise. She had been left behind to tend the embers, to prepare breakfast for the guests who had celebrated long into the night. The sound she expected, the laughter, the shuffling of feet, the clatter of dishes never came. Instead, the silence was so complete that it rang in her ears. The air felt still, as though the world itself was holding something back. She thought, at first, the guests had simply gone to bed late, and that the hall had fallen into a rare quiet. But when she stepped into the main corridor, the scent of smoke and wine had soured into something metallic. The doors to the ballroom were open. She remembered closing them herself before retiring. Now, candlelight still flickered weakly inside, the wax run down to hollow stems. The tables were set exactly as they had been for the feast, the silver polished, the glasses half filled, the wedding cake untouched. A single chair had been overturned near the head table, its legs snapped. No footprints disturbed the layer of spilled wine that had dried dark across the floorboards. The music sheets on the piano had curled at the edges from the night's humidity, but the keys bore the faint impression of fingers fresh, as though someone had played moments before. Clara called out. Once, twice, no answer. She made her way toward the veranda where lanterns still burned against the pale dawn. The carriages remained lined along the gravel drive, horses still tethered but restless, their eyes rolling white at her approach. The ground showed no sign of departure, no tracks leading away, no prints in the mud save her own. And then she saw it, a single shoe, small and satin, lying in the gravel as if dropped mid-step. It was damp with dew, but beside it, the earth was undisturbed, no second print, no owner. By the time Sheriff Clay arrived hours later, the mist had begun to lift, revealing the orchard and the pond beyond. The banquet had gone untouched, yet the air hung thick with the residue of movement like a room recently vacated by too many people. The sheriff found music boxes still turning, their tunes slow and uneven, as though winding down from a long night. In the garden, parasols lay open, their lace stiff with frost, though the air was mild. 118 guests had come to Thornfield Hall, none left by road or foot. No sign of struggle, no blood, no bodies. Only what remained food gone cold, candles burned to stubs, and a sense that whatever had filled the night had not merely ended, but been taken. When the sheriff stepped to the threshold of the ballroom, the faint echo of laughter drifted once through the hall, rising from nowhere and fading before he could name it. He closed the doors behind him, though the sound did not stop immediately. It lingered, thin and distant, like applause heard underwater. Horace Bellamy was a man who believed in proof. He traveled the countryside with his cumbersome equipment packed into a rattling wagon, chemicals, glass plates, and the tall brass-lensed camera that he treated like a companion. When he was invited to photograph the Thorne wedding, he considered it an opportunity to elevate his name beyond county fairs and portraits of farmers' children. The Thornes were respected, even feared, and to be chosen by them meant reputation. He arrived at Thornfield Hall just before dusk, his boots sinking into the damp earth of the orchard road, and found the estate glowing with lanterns strung between the trees. The wedding had already begun. Bellamy set his tripod near the edge of the lawn, where the view of the ceremony was clear. He recalled how still the guests stood, their attention fixed on the couple beneath an arch of white blossoms. When the vows concluded and the kiss began, a strange tremor passed through his fingers. The camera vibrated slightly, though the ground did not move. He assumed it was nerves and held steady. The shutter clicked once. The image, he thought, was perfect. Later that night, he joined the feast for a brief moment to collect his payment. The ballroom was alive with music, but he noticed something peculiar. No laughter accompanied it. The guests moved in rhythm, smiling faintly, yet their eyes appeared fixed elsewhere, as if each watched something invisible hovering above the chandeliers. He took his leave early, uneasy without knowing why. At dawn, While the mist still hung over the fields, Bellamy began to develop his plate in the dark-room wagon behind the inn where he stayed. He poured the developer, counting the seconds under his breath. The image began to form: the arch, the lawn, the altar, Cora and Elias Thorne standing in their wedding attire. But behind them, the crowd did not appear. Where 118 guests should have stood, there was only emptiness. Not the blur of movement or a trick of exposure, just a pale void that seemed to swallow the space entirely. The background itself appeared warped, as if the landscape had bent inward toward the couple. Bellamy thought at first that the chemical mixture had failed. He cleaned the glass, prepared another from his set. But each plate, developed in turn, yielded the same result: the thorns alone, surrounded by absence. The longer he stared, the stranger the photograph became. The edges of the bride's veil seemed to fade into the fog, and Elias's eyes, when held to the light, caught reflections that were not the photographer's own, but a scatter of faces, faint and countless, crowding within the silver nitrate. When Bellamy returned to Thornfield the next morning, the estate was silent. He found the tables still laid for the feast, the candles burned to wax puddles. There was no sign of the living. He left quickly, carrying the glass plate wrapped in cloth, afraid even to look at it again. Weeks later, when he tried to display it in Richmond as evidence of a photographic marvel, the glass cracked clean across the center without being touched. Witnesses said it split silently, as though under pressure from within. Only then did Bellamy admit what he feared most, that he had not captured the wedding of Elias and Cora Thorne, but the instant everything else around them ceased to exist. Sheriff Nathaniel Clay was not a man easily shaken. He had served through the tail end of the war, seen men vanish in smoke and return as ghosts behind their eyes. But what he found at Thornfield Hall that morning would follow him for the rest of his life. He arrived before noon, summoned by a breathless messenger from the neighboring parish who had stumbled upon the scene after finding the roads empty and the manor gates wide open. The day was bright, yet the air felt dim, as though sunlight struggled to touch the estate. The first thing Clay noticed when he dismounted was the stillness. Even the wind seemed to hesitate at the edges of the orchard. The front doors hung ajar. Inside, the ballroom stood exactly as it had the night before, only stripped of its purpose. Tables set, chairs aligned, flowers still fresh, the faint perfume of candles clinging to the drapes. Yet not a single sound broke the quiet: no birds, no buzzing flies, not even the creak of settling beams. He called out once, his voice echoing down the corridor and returning softer, as if absorbed. The polished floor bore no prints except those of his own boots, though the mud outside should have left a trail if anyone had left in haste. Clay's deputy, a young man named Turner, joined him an hour later, and together they swept the grounds. The stables were full, the horses restless but unharmed. The carriages stood ready as though waiting for a journey never taken. In the garden, the remains of the feast lay as if paused mid-celebration. Goblets of wine, silverware gleaming in the morning light, lace gloves left on railings. Turner bent to lift a dropped handkerchief and froze. It was warm, he said later, as if only just held. When they reached the orchard, the air changed. Clay would recall in his report that the temperature dropped sharply, his breath visible though the spring sun still shone. The trees stood too still, their branches heavy with blossoms that did not sway. Beneath them, the ground appeared disturbed, not dug, but rippled, like fabric after a hand passes across it. The sheriff crouched and pressed his fingers to the soil. It was dry, yet an electric hum seemed to pulse faintly through it, a vibration he felt in his bones more than his skin. Back inside, they searched every room. Bedrooms untouched, beds neatly made, belongings undisturbed. In the upstairs hallway they found a dropped candlestick fused to the floor as if melted by lightning, yet no burn mark scarred the wood. The smell of ozone followed them from room to room, sharp and metallic, like the aftermath of a storm that had never arrived. In the chapel, the wedding altar still stood, the candles burned to glassy stumps. Upon the cloth lay a single coin, old and unmarked, pressed deep into the fabric as though placed with deliberate weight. Sheriff Clay stayed until nightfall. He sealed the estate, posted warnings, and wrote in his logbook words that his descendants would later preserve, though he tried to burn them himself. No trace of blood, no sign of violence, he wrote, but the air here carries memory. Something happened in this place, something that took not life, but presence itself. I can hear them in the walls, faintly like whispers swallowed by stone. When he rode away from Thornfield, the mist followed him for miles, and the last sound he heard from the orchard was the faint, rhythmic creak of a swing that no one was sitting on. Samuel Dodd was not a man prone to fancy. He worked the Thorne orchard's edge since boyhood, tending the lower fields and sleeping in a cabin half a mile from the main house. He was plain-spoken, cautious with words, the kind of man who trusted what he could see and little else. When the wedding night came, he stayed back, as instructed, to keep an eye on the livestock and see that no travelers wandered too close. It was work he had done 100 times before, yet something about that evening unsettled him before the first candle was lit. The air carried a tension, he said later, like the charge before lightning. Even the horses shifted restlessly, their ears twitching toward the manor though no sound yet reached them. As dusk fell, Samuel climbed the low ridge behind his cabin to watch the glow of the festivities from afar. He could see Thornfield Hall through the thinning trees, its windows glimmering with hundreds of lights. He remembered thinking the celebration looked almost holy, the whole building pulsing with gold as if alive. From that distance he could just make out the faint hum of a string ensemble, the soft rise and fall of voices. Then came the moment that froze him where he stood. The lights inside flared all at once, brighter than lanterns had any right to burn, a white blaze that flooded the valley below. He threw an arm over his eyes, convinced lightning had struck, but there was no thunder. The brightness lingered longer than natural fire, longer than reason, until it faded with a slow, pulsing rhythm, as if the house itself had taken a breath and exhaled. When the glow died, silence rolled out across the fields so thick he thought his own heartbeat was echoing. The music had stopped. The laughter had stopped. For a time he heard nothing at all. Then, faintly, it returned but wrong. The melody rose again, slower now, warped and hollow, like sound carried through deep water. It had no direction. It seemed to come from the earth itself, not the hall. He listened, paralyzed, as it swelled to a peak, then fractured into fragments, a violin strain, a burst of applause, a single note held too long, and then nothing. He waited until dawn before daring to approach. The mist had gathered low, shrouding the orchard in silver. As he drew closer, the smell hit him ozone and iron, sharp enough to sting his throat. The grass near the boundary fence was pressed flat, not trampled but smoothed, as though a great weight had passed evenly over it. When he reached the main gate, he saw the candles still burning, flickering weakly against the gray morning light. He called out, his voice breaking the silence for the first time, but only the echo returned. Days later, when questioned by Sheriff Clay, Samuel told his story twice the same way, his voice steady but his eyes unmoored. He said the house had not merely gone dark, it had emptied, like breath leaving a lung. The strangest detail he mentioned only once, and even then in a whisper. He swore that in the moment before the lights went out, when the glow burned brightest, he had seen figures moving beyond the windows. Not the guests, not dancers, but pale shadows walking away from the light into it until they were gone. Mirror Lake sat behind Thornfield Hall like a piece of blackened glass, smooth, perfect, and wrong. It was older than the estate, the locals said, a hollow filled long before the first Thorne built stone upon the land. Some claimed it had no true bottom, that the earth fell away into caverns or cracks the river could not find. Others swore that on windless nights, when the moon was thin, you could see the lake ripple without cause as if something beneath had shifted in its sleep. After the wedding's vanishing, Mirror Lake became the focus of the search, for it was the only place large enough to hold so many bodies, and the only place the hounds refused to go near. Sheriff Clay returned 3 days after his first investigation, bringing with him 2 men from the county seat who had worked the river docks as divers. They were accustomed to pulling the drowned from muddy water, but the lake unnerved them from the start. Its surface reflected the sky too clearly, as though it mimicked light rather than absorbed it. They anchored a small rowboat at the center and sank beneath the water, ropes tied to their waists, lanterns in hand. The crowd that gathered along the shore, farmhands, neighbors, the last of the servants, watched in silence as the glow of the lanterns descended into the black. Minutes passed. The water stayed still. Then, from below, a shout. One diver surfaced first, gasping, eyes wide with something beyond fear. "They're down there," he stammered, his voice breaking. "Lined up like soldiers." His partner surfaced soon after, too shaken to speak. The sheriff demanded they explain, and through ragged breaths the first man told what he'd seen: rows of figures standing upright on the lake bed, pale and swaying in the current. Their faces were colorless, indistinct, as though water had blurred them. They did not drift, did not fall apart as the dead should. They simply stood, shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed slightly as if waiting for instruction. When Clay peered into the lake himself, there was nothing. The surface reflected only his own face, rippled by his trembling hand. The divers insisted the shapes had been real, that they'd felt the water pull them toward the figures, like a slow current drawing breath. Yet when they went under again, the lake revealed only stones and silt. No bodies, no trace. Even the ropes they'd used seemed lighter when hauled back in, as though they'd passed through air rather than water. By dusk, the sheriff ordered the search to end. The divers left without collecting pay, refusing to speak further. That night, those who lingered near the shore claimed the lake moved on its own, small waves rolling outward as if something beneath had stirred again. A boy sent to fetch buckets of water the following morning returned pale, saying the reflection had changed, that when he looked down, he saw not the trees behind him, but a ballroom filled with candlelight, and faces pressed against the glassy surface, gazing up from below. The lake was fenced off soon after, though it needed no warning sign. No one went near Mirror Lake again. Even now, locals say that when the wind is still, you can see the faintest shape swaying just beneath its skin, waiting for the light to break. Anna Lee was 17 at the time of the wedding, a small, soft-spoken girl whose duties rarely carried her beyond the kitchens. She had been taken in by the Thorne family as a child after her parents died of fever, and though she served as a maid, she was treated with a curious mixture of kindness and distance, as though the Thornes regarded her less as a servant and more as an object that had simply come with the house. After the disappearance, she was the only living soul found within the estate's walls, discovered huddled behind a linen chest in the servants' quarters, eyes open, pupils blown wide as if they had been staring into darkness for hours. It took 2 days before she spoke, and what she said sent the physicians into silence. Months later, under the watch of attendants in the sanitarium at Charlottesville, she began to write what she remembered in a series of trembling pages. The handwriting was uneven, but the recollection disturbingly clear. She described how, that evening, she had lingered by the ballroom door to watch the guests dance. The music filled the hall like light violins, sharp and bright, laughter rising between notes. She recalled the bride gliding across the floor, her gown trailing behind her like mist, and Elias Thorne smiling with a calm that seemed to silence every other man in the room. Then, without warning, the music faltered. One chord, wrong and sour, cut through the melody. The musicians kept playing, but their arms moved stiffly, as though the rhythm no longer belonged to them. Anna wrote that the air shifted, the chandeliers flickered, and every flame bent inward, as if drawn toward a center no one could see. The dancers slowed. Their smiles fell away, one by one, until they stood in pairs, motionless. The laughter stopped, and the only sound left was the bow of a violin dragging across a string too long. Then their faces began to change. She said it happened quietly, as if time itself were erasing them, eyes hollowing first, then mouths fading, the edges of their forms blurring into the air. They did not fall or cry out. They simply ceased to be, leaving their reflections behind in the mirrored walls of the ballroom. Elias and Cora remained in the center of it all, unmoving. The bride's veil lifted slightly, as though in wind, though the air stood still. Elias turned his head once, looking directly toward the door where Anna stood hidden. She wrote that his eyes met hers, but they did not look through her. They looked into her, as though searching for a place to rest. Then the candles extinguished all at once, and the hall went black. The next thing she recalled was the sound of footsteps, not retreating, not approaching, but circling her, unhurried and heavy with rhythm. She fainted soon after. The doctors dismissed her account as delusion brought on by trauma, but those who read her papers privately noticed something else. In the margins of her final page, written in a steadier hand than the rest, was a single line. They did not vanish. They are behind the glass now. When attendants later searched her room, they found every mirror turned to face the wall. The discovery of the ring came quietly, as if the land itself had chosen the moment to reveal it. 3 days after the disappearance, a group of townsmen gathered at Thornfield's small chapel to search once more for evidence, any trace of what had happened. The chapel sat apart from the manor, half hidden by ivy and encircled by leaning headstones. Its door had been left open since the night of the wedding, and though the candles inside had long burned out, the faint scent of beeswax still lingered in the air. Near the threshold, just before the first step of the altar, one of the men noticed something glinting faintly in the dust. He stooped to pick it up and found a ring, small and delicate, its band dulled by soot and moisture. At first, they assumed it belonged to one of the guests, but when the sheriff examined it later, he recognized the faint engraving along the inner curve times CB*, the initials of the bride. The name had been recorded in the marriage ledger, though no trace of the couple remained to claim it. The ring should have been plain gold, like those common to the region, yet the closer he looked, the more it seemed alive with pattern. Along the outer edge, etched so finely they were nearly invisible, ran a sequence of symbols, half-circles, intersecting lines, and spirals that seemed to twist upon themselves the longer ones stared. The local jeweler, a man who had worked metal all his life, confessed he had never seen such craftsmanship. Not engraving, he said, squinting under the magnifying glass, but carving cut into the gold itself, like writing that doesn't want to be read. When the sheriff pressed further, he admitted the markings reminded him of something once shown to him by a traveling tinker, a set of talismans taken from graves deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Symbols used by settlers 2 centuries earlier to bind spirits to the soil, a safeguard against the restless dead. As word spread, so did fear. The chapel drew visitors who came in silence, leaving tokens, bits of cloth, dried flowers, coins, as if to appease whatever force lingered there. Those who touched the ring spoke of a sensation like heat, but not on the skin, deeper, pulsing through the bone. One woman claimed that when she looked at it too long, she could hear faint whispers rising from the metal, words she could not understand but felt compelled to answer. The sheriff locked the ring in the county office, though it did not remain there long. Within a week, the drawer where it was kept warped shut, the wood swelling, as if from moisture, though the air was dry. When they finally forced it open, the ring was gone. Only the imprint of its circle remained pressed into the paper ledger beneath. Some said it had been taken back. Others whispered that whoever had made it had never left. Months later, a letter arrived from a scholar in Richmond who had read about the incident through rumor. He wrote of an ancient belief among mountain folk, a covenant sign carved into metal, used during forbidden rites to seal a promise between the living and the earth itself. It is not a symbol of union, he warned in his closing line, but of containment. It does not bind love, it binds what love awakens. The mystery of Father Malcolm Rains emerged slowly, like a bruise beneath the skin. In the days following the disappearance, Sheriff Clay began tracing every name listed on the wedding ledger, hoping to build a map of the guests' lives before they vanished. Most could be tied to homes, to families, to trades, but when he came to the officiant's entry, he found only emptiness. Father Malcolm Rains, parish of Street Havelock. The ink read, neat and deliberate, yet no such parish existed within 100 miles of Albemarle County or anywhere in Virginia's records at all. At first, Clay assumed a clerical error. He rode to Charlottesville to consult the diocese, certain someone would recall the man. The bishop there frowned when shown the name, rifled through ledgers, and shook his head. "We have no Father Rains," he said. "And no Street Havelock. Whoever wrote that line invented both." When Clay pressed further, describing the officiant's role at the Thorne wedding, the bishop's expression changed from confusion to quiet unease. "There was a Street Havelock mission once," he admitted after a pause, "but it was never consecrated. Burned before it opened its doors 30 years ago this spring." Now, no photograph of Father Rains existed. The only image taken that night, the infamous wedding plate, showed only Elias and Cora Thorne, the priest's place behind them blurred into a pale haze. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts of his appearance. Some said he was tall, thin as a shadow, with hair white as chalk. Others swore he was young, dark-haired, his eyes sharp and unblinking. One guest recalled his voice most of all calm, measured, and so low it made the pews hum. He carried no Bible, only a small black book bound with twine. The sheriff's notes mention a strange detail found on the altar after the wedding: a folded scrap of parchment, brittle and damp, bearing a single Latin phrase written in rust-colored ink, times sic vinculum tenit asterisk. Thus the bond is held. Beneath the words, a faint mark like the impression of a ring pressed into the page. The handwriting did not match any found in the Thorne household. Clay sent the paper to the diocese for translation and received no reply. When he wrote again weeks later, his letter was returned unopened, the envelope stamped Times undeliverable. Asterisk. Rumors began to spread through the county that Father Rains had appeared before the Thornes weeks prior to the ceremony, uninvited and unexpected. A peddler claimed to have seen a man in black walking the orchard road at dusk, barefoot, carrying a lantern whose flame never flickered in the wind. Servants later whispered that Cora herself had insisted on his presence, saying he had come at the family's request. When asked what she meant, she reportedly answered, "Not Elias's family, the older one." Ah. No trace of Rains was ever found after the wedding. No grave, no record of departure. Yet every few years, parish ledgers across the region would turn up odd entries written in unfamiliar hands: baptisms, funerals, blessings, each signed with the same name. Asterisk M. Rains. Asterisk. No priest ever claimed them. The handwriting, when compared to the note from Thornfield's altar, was identical. The final mention came from a mountain chapel 3 counties away, where a minister reported a stranger performing last rites for a dying child. When asked what parish he hailed from, the man smiled and said, "Where the vows still hold." He vanished before sunrise. By the spring of 1872, Thornfield Hall had been sealed for nearly a year. Ivy had begun to reclaim the outer walls, and the once bright windows now reflected only the dull sheen of neglect. Yet curiosity has a way of surviving even when reason cannot, and so the county authorized a team of investigators, 3 men and 1 woman from Richmond, to re-enter the estate in search of what the locals called Times evidence of mass disappearance. Asterisk. They came armed, not with weapons, but with notebooks, measuring tools, and the hollow certainty of those who believe explanation can quiet fear. The first to cross the threshold noted the air itself seemed heavier inside, as if the house still carried the weight of the vanished guests. The smell of dust and wax lingered, faintly sweet, faintly spoiled. They moved carefully through the lower corridors, their footsteps echoing in uneven rhythm. It was when they reached the ballroom that the first sound came. A faint clap, sharp, single, as though someone in the corner had struck their hands together once. Then another, softer, joined it, followed by the brittle echo of many. The four investigators froze, each believing the others to be responsible. But the sound persisted, spreading around them, filling the high-ceilinged room with a hollow applause that rose and fell like breath. There was no movement in the mirrors, no shifting of curtains. Only the sound, polite, rhythmic, and distant, as though the walls themselves remembered the celebration. When the echoes faded, one of the men knelt to examine the floor. His hand came up covered in dust, but beneath it lay something strange, a faint outline of a shoe print, small and distinct. Then, another beside it. And another. Dozens. They traced a path that led from the center of the room to the edges, forming a ring, as if an invisible crowd had once circled the newlyweds and never dispersed. They marked and sketched what they saw before retreating at dusk. The next morning, when they returned to complete their survey, the floor had changed. The prints from the day before were gone, replaced by hundreds more layer upon layer, filling the entire expanse of the ballroom. Some were so faint they seemed to hover just beneath the dust, half-formed. The investigators counted until the act became meaningless. There were too many to number, each print slightly different in size and angle, yet none leaving a trail to or from the door. The woman among them, a historian named Eliza Hart, recorded in her journal that as she stood in the center of the room, she heard the faint shuffle of fabric, as though skirts brushed against the floor near her. She called out and received no answer, but the air shifted against her cheek, cool and deliberate, like someone passing by. Later, she would insist she saw the chandeliers sway, though there was no draft, and that the mirrors along the far wall seemed to ripple, faintly, as if touched by unseen hands. When the team departed that evening, none spoke during the carriage ride back to town. Their reports, when filed, were inconsistent and strangely incomplete, pages missing, words smudged beyond reading. What remained consistent was a single phrase that appeared, in different handwriting, across all four journals: "They are still dancing." Years later, when the house was briefly opened again, a caretaker sweeping the ballroom found what he thought were seeds scattered in the dust. But when he bent down to collect them, he saw they were not seeds at all, but tiny flakes of gold leaf, arranged in a ring the size of a wedding band. The moment he touched them, the faint sound of clapping rose again from the shadows, soft and measured, as if welcoming him back to the celebration. The discovery of Cora Thorne's journal came not from official hands but from accident. In late autumn of 1872, nearly a year after the investigation of Thornfield had ended, a local carpenter named James Weller was hired to board the manor's lower windows in an effort to keep looters and the curious at bay. He worked mostly in silence, accompanied only by the faint smell of damp wood and the hollow thud of his own hammer. When he reached the east bedroom, the chamber said to have been prepared for the bride, he found the walls swollen with age and a loose plank near the fireplace. Behind it, wrapped in faded linen, was a small leather-bound book, its cover warped by moisture, but its pages astonishingly intact. The first entries were ordinary enough, the handwriting elegant and deliberate. Cora wrote of preparations for the wedding, of the long dresses sent from Richmond, of her uncertainty about leaving behind the small life she had known. Her words were tender, though touched with restraint, as if she feared her joy might draw something unwanted. But as the pages turned, the tone changed. The letters slanted more sharply, the lines grew shorter. She began to describe Elias in a way that wavered between devotion and dread. "He is kind, and yet I cannot shake the feeling that his kindness hides something deeper," one entry read. "At night, he walks the orchard though there is no moon. He says he dreams better there." In later passages, her writing took on a fevered rhythm. She spoke of the orchard whispering names times the old ones, asterisk, as Elias called them, and of the trees that swayed though the wind was still. "He told me the soil remembers," she wrote, "and that the earth beneath Thornfield does not sleep. The closer the date of the wedding came, the more her words tangled between fear and loyalty. She described her veil trembling on its own, her reflection in the dressing mirror standing slightly apart, delayed by a heartbeat. The servants, she noted, avoided Elias's gaze, claiming that his shadow did not fall the same as theirs. The final entry stopped the heart of every person who read it. The handwriting, though hurried, remained legible. The lines pressed deep into the paper, as though written with shaking hands. Elias dreams of the old orchard, she wrote. He says the trees whisper the names of the dead. I fear he means to join them. He told me tonight. The sentence broke there. The quill had dragged across the page, leaving a dark streak where the ink had pooled, as if the pen had been snatched mid-word. The blot was still glossy when the journal was found, as though it had been written only hours earlier. The journal was taken to the county archives, where it vanished within a month. The clerk responsible for its cataloging left a single note before resigning his post. It read simply, her last page bled through the paper. When held to the light, there were more words too faint to read, but the pattern of the ink formed a ring. Years later, Thornfield's orchard grew wild again. The trees twisted and overgrown, and those who walked its edge claimed to hear whispering in the leaves. The names carried on the wind were never clear, but one of them, always, sounded like Cora. The first letter arrived in the spring of 1875, 3 years after Thornfield Hall had gone silent. It came folded neatly within an envelope bearing a wax seal impressed with an unfamiliar crest, a serpent coiled around a key. The handwriting was elegant but foreign, the loops too precise to belong to any local hand. It was addressed plainly, asterisk to Mr. Elias Thorne, Thornfield Hall, Albemarle County, Virginia, United States of America, asterisk. The postal clerk who received it hesitated before delivering it. For by then everyone in the county knew the Thorne estate was abandoned. Still, procedure demanded it be sent, and so the letter was left at the county office, where it sat unopened until curiosity overcame duty. When Sheriff Clay unsealed it, the contents were brief but chilling. My dearest Elias, it began, I trust this finds you in continued strength. The matter proceeds as you foresaw. The guests are where they belong, and the transition holds. The pattern has stabilized. We will await your signal before expanding further. It was signed only with an initial times A*. Clay dismissed it at first as a hoax, perhaps some cruel attempt to reignite an old wound. Yet, when he checked the postmark, he found it genuine London, dated February 14th, 1875. Over the following months, more letters arrived. Each bore the same seal, the same delicate script, and each addressed to the same name, Elias Thorne. The sheriff kept them sealed for as long as he could, but the unease in him grew until he could no longer resist reading. They spoke of rituals completed, of circles held fast, and mirrors aligned. In one, the writer congratulated Elias for achieving communion between the seen and the unseen. Another warned of the strain upon the vessel and urged him to anchor the living with the dead, lest they drift. It was language unlike anything Clay had ever read, half scientific, half sacred. The final letter, dated October 1877, came with a faint scent of sea salt and smoke. Its ink had bled along the edges, as though dampened by fog. Elias, it read, the lights over the Thames answered last night. The reflection held, and your image appeared as promised. You were right, the gate is not built, it is remembered. The others await you, though you must not delay. The bond weakens with distance. Return soon, for the glass grows thin. When Clay attempted to trace the sender, he found that the address somewhere along Limehouse Cut did not exist. The street had been demolished decades earlier after a fire consumed most of the buildings there. No record of a resident with the initial A appeared in any registry. Yet the letters kept arriving, 1 or 2 each year, for nearly a decade. Sometimes they came weeks apart, sometimes months, but always postmarked from London, always in the same hand. The last, received in 1883, contained only one line, The reflection must be fed. It was unsigned, the wax seal unbroken, as though it had sealed itself after being written. By then, the sheriff had retired, his hair gone white. He kept the letters locked in a drawer, refusing to burn them, though he could not explain why. Those who later inherited his belongings found them bundled in twine, the paper faintly damp to the touch. The ink, when exposed to light, shimmered like the surface of water, and on the back of every page, barely visible except under the right angle, was the faint outline of a crowd. Hundreds of blurred figures standing in a circle, their faces turned toward the reader, waiting. Horace Bellamy's name had become something of a curiosity after the events at Thornfield. In the years following the disappearance of the wedding guests, people sought him out, journalists, spiritualists, and those who simply wanted to look upon the man who had captured the only surviving image of that night. He never spoke willingly of what he'd seen. When pressed, he would only say that the photograph was an error, a trick of light, that the crowd had moved too quickly for the plate to catch. Yet those who heard him say it always remarked that his hands trembled as he spoke, and that his eyes lingered on corners of the room where no one stood. By 1873, Bellamy's small studio in Richmond had fallen into disrepair. He no longer took commissions, instead locking himself inside for days at a time. The neighbors complained of strange smells, burned chemicals and wet metal, and of light that flashed at night through the boarded windows. One evening in late September, smoke began to rise from the building. By the time the fire brigade arrived, the entire studio was engulfed. They pulled Bellamy's assistant from the street outside, dazed and choking, muttering that the fire had started without flame. He said the glass plates on the shelves had begun to hum, vibrating so violently that they shattered on their own. He was trying to stop it, the man said, coughing through soot. He kept saying it was waking up. When the blaze was finally subdued, little remained but the iron frame of the press and the twisted remnants of the darkroom trays. Yet, amid the wreckage, one plate had survived. It lay face down on the floor, uncracked, the emulsion untouched. When lifted to the light, it revealed what was unmistakably the Thornfield wedding image, the bride and groom alone before the void where their guests should have stood. The assistant swore it had not been there before the fire, that Bellamy had hidden it months earlier. He refused to touch it again. Bellamy himself was never found. Theories spread quickly that he had fled, that he had burned with the building, that he had gone mad and wandered into the James River. But the official record noted no remains recovered. A search of his rented rooms turned up a journal singed at the edges, its final pages filled with frantic script. "It looks different each time," one line read. "When I stare long enough, I see faces in the fog, some watching, some trying to leave. They are not gone. They are waiting for the rest." The Thornfield plate was taken into police custody, then passed to the county archives, where it remained for nearly a decade. Every attempt to photograph or copy it failed. In some exposures, the figures vanished entirely, leaving only the suggestion of shapes behind the glass. In others, the background appeared to shift, the lawn bending inward, the sky darkening until the bride and groom seemed to stand at the edge of a storm. One archivist resigned after claiming the photograph had changed overnight, that the empty field behind the couple now held faint silhouettes, as if the missing guests were returning one by one. Years later, when the archives relocated to a new building, the Thornfield plate went missing. The crate that should have contained it was found empty, though the packing straw inside was wet to the touch. The inventory clerk noted the smell of sulfur and rain. No record of the photograph has surfaced since, though every few decades, rumors resurface of a glass plate offered quietly to collectors, of an image that cannot be developed without distortion. Those who claim to have seen it say that the couple still stand together, unchanged, but that behind them, the crowd has returned, blurred and endless, their faces pressed close to the lens, staring outward, as if waiting for someone to take their place. By the spring of 1874, Thornfield Hall had become more than a ruin. It was a wound the county could not forget. The doors were chained, the shutters bolted, yet each year, as the anniversary of the wedding approached, the locals claimed the house came alive again. It began quietly at first, a faint vibration underfoot that traveled through the soil like a pulse. Then, as night deepened, the air near the estate grew heavy with the scent of candle wax and apple blossom, though no flowers had bloomed there in years. By midnight, those who dared to stand along the orchard road swore they could see a glow flickering through the cracks in the boarded windows, soft at first, then growing brighter until the house seemed to breathe with light. The first reports came from a pair of farmhands returning from market. They claimed they heard music drifting from the manor violins, delicate and slow, playing the same waltz that had been performed on the night of the wedding. One of them, a man named Joseph Crane, said he saw movement through the window slats, two figures turning slowly in the candlelight, locked together as if time had forgotten them. The second man refused to look. He said the air felt wrong, too thick, as though the night itself had drawn closer to listen. Word spread through Albemarle County, and by the following spring, the phenomenon had drawn quiet gatherings to the edge of the property. Families would come at dusk, keeping their distance from the gates. The same pattern always followed. First the faint glow from the ballroom, then the rising hum of music that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Those who stayed long enough claimed they could make out the shapes within the bride and groom, unchanged, locked in their first and final kiss, unmoving, aglow in a light that did not flicker. No other guests appeared, no laughter or applause, only the endless waltz and that motionless embrace. Witnesses described the figures as neither fully solid nor spectral. Their forms shimmered faintly, as though submerged beneath glass. A few swore they saw the bride's veil move, rippling like fabric underwater. One child, years later, told of hearing whispering through the music a murmur that repeated the same word again and again, though no one could agree on what it was. Some said, "Remember," others, "Return." All agreed that the sound came not from the hall but from behind them, from the dark orchard that watched in silence. By the 1,880 seconds, the story of the repeated kiss had become legend. Travelers came from neighboring towns to witness it, though most left before midnight, unnerved by the stillness of the air and the way the moon seemed to fade when the lights within the house began to glow. A few brave or foolish souls tried to enter Thornfield on those nights. None managed to cross the threshold. They described an invisible pressure pushing them back, a resistance like air turned to stone. One man claimed that when he touched the doorknob, he saw his reflection not as himself, but as the groom, his own face turned upward, lips pressed to an unseen bride. He fled screaming into the orchard, never to return. Even now, the locals speak of it in low voices. Every spring, as the air warms and the blossoms stir, the ruins of Thornfield seem to awaken. Through the cracks in the walls, candlelight glows faintly once more, and the faint echo of a waltz drifts across the hills. The figures remain unchanged, frozen in their endless kiss, bound by whatever vow was spoken that night. And those who have seen them up close say the strangest thing of all. Though their faces never move, the reflection of their eyes does shifting, slowly, as if searching the darkness beyond the glass for someone still watching. By the spring of 1,876, the orchard that had once been the pride of Thornfield Hall stood in eerie stillness. Once it had been known across Albemarle County for its strange abundance, apples so dark they seemed almost purple, sweet enough to perfume the air for miles. But after the wedding, the trees grew silent. The blossoms that appeared each spring shriveled before they could open, and the fruit that did grow rotted on the branch before ripening. Neighbors began to say the orchard was cursed, that the soil had soured from grief or sin. Others said the trees themselves were keeping watch, unwilling to yield what they had once given so freely. The sheriff, long since weary of Thornfield's mysteries, ordered the land inspected. A team of woodcutters was sent to clear a portion of the orchard, hoping perhaps the soil beneath could be turned to new growth. They worked only in daylight, and even then, unease clung to them. The sound of the axes echoed strangely through the valley, dull and hollow, as if the trees absorbed the noise rather than returned it. When the first trunk fell, the men swore it did not fall naturally but shuddered, bending as though resisting the final blow. The moment it struck the ground, a hush spread through the grove so complete that even the insects ceased their hum. One of the men, curious, knelt beside the fallen tree to count its rings. What he found froze him in place. The pattern of the wood was not smooth but warped, the rings bending and curling into the faint shapes of faces. Dozens of them, barely formed yet unmistakable, eyes wide, mouths parted in what could only be described as astonishment or terror. The expressions repeated along the length of the trunk, each one slightly different, as though captured in motion. When the sunlight shifted, the features seemed to deepen, and for a moment, it appeared as though the wood itself were breathing. Word spread quickly. The woodcutters refused to fell another tree, claiming that the remaining trunks whispered when the wind moved through them. A boy who ventured into the orchard at dusk returned pale and speechless, insisting he had heard names spoken among the branches, names of people who had vanished at the wedding. His mother burned his clothes and forbade him to leave the house again. By autumn, the orchard had become a forbidden place, its paths overgrown, its silence thick enough to make even the bravest passerby quicken their steps. Years later, a scholar from Richmond, intrigued by the rumors, obtained a small cross-section of one of the trees. He presented it to a naturalist for study, hoping to prove the faces an illusion of disease or pattern. The sample was sealed in glass, displayed under careful light. Within days, condensation began to form inside the case. The grain darkened, and the faint outlines of eyes reappeared more defined now, almost pleading. The naturalist's assistant, who tended the exhibit, claimed that the ring pattern shifted when no one was watching, and that on quiet nights he could hear faint knocking from within the display, slow and rhythmic, like a heart that refused to stop beating. Eventually, the sample vanished. In its place was left only a damp stain shaped like an open mouth. The remaining orchard still stands, twisted and black, the trees barren but alive. On windless nights, travelers swear they can hear the faint rustle of leaves that should not move, and if they listen too long, they say the trees begin to whisper again, each voice carrying a single word. Asterisk stay, asterisk. The man's name was Edwin Lark, a London-born antiques dealer who had made a small fortune trading in curiosities items with just enough superstition clinging to them to sell as conversation pieces. When word reached him of a photograph tied to the infamous Thorne disappearance, he could not resist. The story had drifted overseas like a fever dream. An American wedding, an entire crowd vanished, a single image surviving. It was precisely the sort of artifact collectors sought, a relic touched by mystery. Lark contacted a broker in Virginia and, after weeks of correspondence, secured the Thorne plate for a sum that would have bought him a house. The transaction was discreet, and the photograph arrived in a plain crate, its glass cushioned by straw and wrapped in oilcloth that smelled faintly of rain. He opened it one evening by lamplight, unwrapping it slowly as though unveiling a sacred object. Beneath the cloth, the image gleamed with a silvery sheen, untouched by time. The bride and groom stood frozen at the altar, and behind them stretched the familiar void grass, fog, and nothing else. He expected some evidence of trickery, perhaps an exposure flaw or chemical burn, but the plate was flawless. It captured absence with perfect precision. And yet, the longer he looked, the less certain he became that the emptiness was truly empty. There were impressions within the fog indentations, faint shadows that suggested shapes. When he tilted the glass toward the light, those shadows deepened, forming what seemed to be faces. Lark displayed the photograph in his parlor beside a tall, gilt-edged mirror that he had always considered his prized possession. Clients often admired the pairing, the mirror doubling the image, creating the illusion that one could step through from the room into the photograph itself. But within days, his servants began to complain. They claimed the mirror no longer reflected them properly, that their movements lagged behind or their faces appeared blurred, as though they were being watched by something behind the glass. At first, Lark dismissed the talk as nervous fancy, but one night, while locking the parlor, he noticed something strange. In the reflection, the photograph's image had changed. The figures of the bride and groom remained, but the background now shimmered faintly with light, like chandeliers beginning to glow. Over the next weeks, the phenomenon worsened. Visitors reported hearing faint music in the house, a waltz that played only when they were alone. The mirror grew colder to the touch. Lark began to cover it with a drape each night, yet every morning he found the cloth pulled aside. On the final evening of his life, a neighbor passing by saw the lights in Lark's home burning bright well past midnight. She swore she heard laughter, dozens of voices overlapping, rising in bursts of applause. The next morning, the housekeeper found him in the parlor, seated before the mirror. His body was still, his face tilted slightly upward, eyes wide open but glassy, as though frozen mid-recognition. There were no signs of struggle, no wound, no disturbance. The mirror, however, did not reflect the room. Instead, it showed a ballroom, dimly lit and filled with motion figures swaying in slow rhythm, faceless dancers moving in endless circles. The image shimmered only for moments before fading back into still glass. Authorities dismissed the account as hysteria, though the mirror was quietly removed and sold at auction. The Thorne photograph was nowhere to be found. Some say it was buried with Lark. Others claim it returned to America, to the soil where its story began. But a few who dealt with Lark in those final days whispered something stranger, that his reflection, faint and flickering, still appeared in mirrors long after his death, seated as he had been that night, watching as the dancers behind him turned without end, waiting for the music to begin again. The summer of 1902 was unusually dry in Albemarle County, and the ground around Thornfield Hall cracked under the weight of drought. The land had long since changed hands, sold to a farmer named Henry Cale, who intended to clear the edges of the old thorn orchard for planting. Most locals warned him against it, muttering that the soil there was unsettled, but Cale was a practical man who believed superstition a luxury for the idle. His workers began digging the new foundation in July, turning up thick roots and bits of weathered stone, remnants of the hall's collapsed eastern wing. On the third day, one man's shovel struck something hollow, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the ground like the toll of a distant bell. When they cleared the soil away, what emerged was not part of any farmhouse, but a staircase narrow and steep, descending into darkness. The air that rose from below was cool and faintly metallic, tinged with something sweet, like rotting fruit. The men hesitated, then lit their lanterns and descended. Beneath the earth they found walls of stone fitted too precisely for the era, etched with faint symbols that crumbled at the touch. At the center of the chamber stood a row of wooden boxes, coffins, though smaller than any built for men. There were dozens, stacked in neat formation, their lids sealed with blackened nails. When Cale pried one open, he recoiled. Inside was no body, no sign of decay, only soil dark, rich, and strangely damp. Mixed within it were shards of glass, glimmering faintly in the lantern light, and scraps of lace so clean they seemed newly woven. Another box held the same, and another, until the air grew thick with dust and unease. The men whispered that the shards looked like fragments of mirrors, the edges sharp enough to cut even through gloves. One worker, curious, sifted through the soil and pulled up a piece large enough to catch his reflection. He swore he saw not his own face, but the faint outline of a woman's eyes closed, lips parted as though whispering. The fragment shattered before he could show the others. Cale ordered the site sealed immediately, but it was too late. That night, every mirror in his farmhouse cracked from corner to corner. The livestock refused to enter the new pen, and his youngest daughter woke screaming, claiming she had dreamed of rows of people standing beneath the orchard, their hands folded, their faces filled with soil. Within a week, Cale abandoned the property altogether. News of the discovery spread quietly, for no one wished to disturb whatever lay buried there. The county sent an inspector who dismissed the site as an old root cellar, though his report contained one peculiar note. The soil within the coffins was of a type not found anywhere in the region. It contained traces of silver nitrate, the same chemical used in early photography. Years later, when a storm uprooted one of the remaining apple trees, the ground around its roots collapsed into a shallow pit. At the bottom lay a single coffin, smaller than the rest, its lid splintered. Inside was only earth and a piece of bridal lace, pressed flat against the wood as if placed there by a careful hand. Those who saw it swore they smelled candle wax and lilac before the pit was filled again. None have touched that soil since, for the old men still say that what sleeps beneath Thornfield is not dead, but developing, waiting for the right light to rise once more. By the turn of the 20th century, Thornfield Hall had passed from legend into study. Universities sent scholars and skeptics to Albemarle County, each determined to strip the story of its superstition and find the science beneath. They came with measuring rods, air pumps, and notebooks, speaking of fault lines and vapors. One theory claimed that gas had seeped up from the limestone beneath the orchard, releasing a hallucinogenic haze that caused panic and flight. Another suggested a collapse in the water table, that the guests had fallen into some hidden sinkhole and been buried without trace. The explanations multiplied, polished and rational, until they resembled prayers disguised as reason, each an attempt to fill the silence that still surrounded Thornfield. But the silence did not yield. The house, though long abandoned, refused to crumble. Its walls blackened, its windows gone, yet the foundation stood as though something beneath held it fast. Those who trespassed to collect soil samples often returned ill, their lungs burning, their dreams troubled by music. The instruments they left behind were found later twisted, their glass tubes shattered from within. In 1921, a geologist who spent 3 nights surveying the site wrote in his notes, "No gas, no heat, no movement. But something hums in the ground, a constant tone too deep for the ear. When I stand still, it feels as if the earth is breathing." He burned his equipment on the 4th day and never published his findings. Others sought answers elsewhere. A folklorist from Virginia Seminary compared the Thorne case to old European covenant ceremonies said to bind more than the living. He pointed out that the symbols on Cora's ring matched 15th century sigils used to fix presents, markings believed to preserve a moment outside of time. In his papers, he wrote that perhaps the Thornes had not vanished at all, but succeeded in something unspeakably precise, a union that froze the instant of their vow so completely that it consumed everything around it. They did not disappear, he concluded. They continued. The kiss was not an end, but an opening. Even now, locals claim the ballroom remains untouched by decay. Hunters who stray too close hear faint applause in the wind, or glimpse light moving through the empty windows, though no fire burns within. Some insist that if you stand at the orchard's edge on a spring night, you can see the reflection of a chandelier flicker across Mirror Lake, though the lake itself lies dry and cracked. The modern world has paved the roads and buried the old paths, but the Thornfield land remains vacant, bought and sold yet never built upon. The county surveyors say the soil will not hold a foundation. The ground shifts beneath their instruments, subtly but persistently, as if the land itself refuses intrusion. And so the mystery endures, half folklore, half evidence, balanced between memory and dread. Those who have studied the case for decades often end their lectures the same way, with the photograph. It has surfaced and vanished more than once, changing slightly each time it appears. In the most recent copy, the bride and groom are still locked in their kiss, yet behind them, faint and endless, the crowd has returned. Their faces are indistinct, but their hands are raised, mid-applause. The ballroom, it seems, waits still unlit, unending, forever between moments. And in that frozen silence, one can almost hear the whisper of a promise never broken, echoing across the years like a vow that time itself was forced to keep.